Well, thank you for this introduction. It is a very special quality, I think, of this conference, that we have so many distinguished speakers and scholars from so many different parts of the world here in Almere, and that also Almere will be part of this study that we are engaging in. Also tomorrow, the schaalsprong, the scale jump of Almere, will be part of the program, and especially examining the question if this could be seen as a social democratic experiment in planning. So also in Almere, in this particular story, there's a lot of issues that relate to this conference. Well, let me give a short introduction to the program of these next 2 days, and I would like to have my slides. Let me start with telling you that this conference has been organized not just by INTI, but also by the Technical University in Delft, Chair Designers Politics, of which Professor Wouter van Stiphout is sitting here on the first row, and the University of Amsterdam, the Han Lammers Chair, which is Arnold Reindorp, who unfortunately cannot be here these days. But he was also one of the organizers of this conference, these three parties. Well, why did we organize a conference on this theme? This is what I want to, not extensively but briefly, touch on a number of themes which made us organize this: new towns and politics. Of course, it has been mentioned before, it's a well-known fact, the worldwide strong urbanization that takes place leads to a wave of urbanization, and this happens in countries which are very different, with and without economic growth, in countries with very different political systems also. But as you can see, most of the cities that are being expanded so rapidly are in the zone where the Human Development Index is quite low. This also means that these cities take place, they are in China, with its a capitalist yet authoritarian state, but with a growing economy. But it also takes place in Africa, with its states which are still struggling with corruption, difficult political systems, military upheavals, unrest, wars, and lack of economic growth, of course. So it's not hard to predict that urbanization takes very different shapes due to these different political and economic conditions. In general, you could say that in the southern eastern countries like China, India, or Korea, new towns are being planned. So there's a planned endeavor to develop new towns to contain this urbanization. In the African countries, there are some initiatives, but mostly urbanization takes the form of slums. So that's the result of this urbanization is canalized in very, very different ways. In the introduction to this reader, we stated that new towns are the ultimate political act. And then, of course, you deal with a lot of different definitions with what exactly is political. In this case, there's at least two definitions of politics. The politics of decision-making, which sort of overlaps with the politics as government, the decision to build a city, a far-reaching decision to build a city from scratch and also organize it. So that deals with politics as government, as institutions. But there's also the politics of negotiation. It takes a lot of negotiation that's the politics in the daily sense of speaking, with a lot of parties to make a city. So you could say politics is a daily activity by which a city is made. And some of you will recognize all these figureheads of the Almere city center shaking hands like 10 years ago, agreeing on the new center that we are in now. If you look at this point that both the government and then the daily politics are part of the making of a city, makes it understandable that it looks it seems like if authoritarian states, dictatorial regimes, are better in planning. Makes things easier, less parties, less actors that deal in the process, so there's less complicated politics. But don't forget that also the machinery of the democratic welfare state was extremely good in planning. Think of the Western European new towns from the 60s with its efficient machinery of state-led government, for instance, led to the French banlieue and the Ville Nouvelle, on which Kenny Coopers will later speak. But the question here is, when you look at social democratic or dictatorial regimes in their cities, is the outcome different? Are democratic cities different from authoritarian cities? Are they better? Is there such a thing as a democratic or an authoritarian city? And if so, by what can it be recognized? And who defines it? The planner, the architect, or the policymaker and the politician, and the whole apparatus behind it? Is it different for an architect to work in a democratic country from an authoritarian one? If you compare the process, the rules, the relation to the client, the fee maybe, and finally the results, are they any different? On this topic we have Kees Christiaanse and Nathalie de Vries of MVRDV, who have both worked extensively in both types of countries, and they will hopefully shed a light on these questions later this day. Well, now here's a first for me, because I have never ever used a reference to the old Greeks before, honestly. But in this case, there's really no escape. New towns, politics. Politics comes from the word polis, meaning city. So there's a very close and direct bond between the city and politics. They're connected in the root, so to speak. And Aristotle wrote on the idea of the polis extensively, and without going into that too much, I would like to pick out 2 points which are relevant here. The first thing being that the polis is, in Aristotle's eyes, is a natural phenomenon. A human being is a collective being by nature. He organizes himself first in pairs, then in a household, then in a family, then a village, and eventually in a polis, which not only means city, but also the community, the collective. So the hierarchical thinking that we are so familiar with from the 20th century, from the neighborhood principle, for instance, or the wijkgedachte, in which you see this scheme here from the 50s, and the idea of community was obviously already present more than 2,000 years ago. So the cornerstones of the whole modernist new town planning you can actually find 2,300 years ago. And the same goes for the ideal size of a community. The polis of Aristotle had 6,000 households. This was the ideal size of a city. Times 5 or 6, equaling the Greek household, that's about 30 or 40,000 inhabitants. Ebenezer Howard, the inescapable godfather of the New Town movement, repeated this size as a maximum for a well-designed city. And after that, a new city should be built, also no bigger than this number of households. So as my colleague Wouter has written, Howard's precisely quantified model, in which numbers of inhabitants, services, sizes and distances are fixed, is an operational version of Aristotle's ideal Greek polis, or Plato's ideal city, in which also the ideal size of a community to function properly is emphasized. So that a new city should comply with a set of standardized ideal rules and numbers is something which connects the city from Aristotle's times with the 20th century new towns. The ideal, to a certain extent, utopian content is something which connects all new towns. Also with Aristotle, that was the same thing. The polis was meant to give its inhabitants a good life. Good meaning happy, but also morally just. And this also, Howard looks as if he could also use something of the good life. And this also goes for Howard's Garden City. His scheme was also coupled with a political change, with an ideal idea of society. It's often forgotten, but his garden cities would also be a means of social and political reform. Well, of course, nowadays there's just little belief in the political meaning of design, in the possibilities of design to change or influence, or even to engage with social and political issues, like the end of ideology, the end of malleability, and the belief that design can change society or create the new man. That seems to be largely in the past. Of course, this used to be different earlier in the 20th century. In the post-war era, during the Cold War period, for instance, you had on the communist side, you had numerous books like these about communist or socialist planning, with ideals like equality and collectivity, and about creating the new socialist man. And planning would contribute to that. And in the West, we had these social democratic new towns with their open layout, aiming to create democratic and also open-minded urbanites. And this even went so far that the export of modernist urban planning to the Third World looked the same, used the same principles. It was also open schemes, open designs to help these third world countries to become democratic and open-minded. But then in the evaluation, of course, the latest, the most recent decades, in the evaluation, these cities are judged to be only claiming to be very, very different urban models. But in retrospect, we see mostly similarities. They are often the very same spatial models, but with a different narrative. So on one hand, the open city is claimed to be a social democratic open city. On the other hand, it's claimed to be the equal socialist communist city. So the role of architects, most architects, even in this period, claimed to be like non-professional, non-political professionals. They are improving lives. They are building technical, aesthetic projects. They deny any large ambitions, so to speak. And but you could say, sure, you can be just a good designer, but that doesn't mean that the city resulting from this work couldn't also be a political instrument for the client, usually a government. And I don't think there's anything wrong, sinister, or morally unethic to that, because if you consider the city to be the ultimate political deed, it necessarily has its content. A city is not just a product of a planner or architect. But while we can see, for instance, the political ideas behind the series of new towns in Israel very clearly, like Tzviafat will later explain, it is a lot harder for us to analyze contemporary city plans in the same manner. But you could say, if these older cities can be analyzed in a political way, can't the recent ones? So that's exactly what we're aiming to do in this conference. And there are a number of examples of this. For instance, there is one speaker will talk about the difference between the cities built for the Shah of Iran and a later generation which is built for the Islamic Ayatollahs, very different ones. And also Almere's recent planning projects, like the new owner-built areas. They can be regarded an example to develop a sort of true socialist democratic, social democratic planning. Well, I think an awareness of the political context of our city planning is more relevant since we now, as René Peters already mentioned, we witness a period in Holland with, again, a paradigm shift in which the politics have completely changed, and in which the Ministry of VROM, that was Traffic, Spatial Planning and Environment, is split up. And this leaves us with a new Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment, while housing is banned to internal affairs. So there is, even in this change of names, there is a suggestion that space and spatial planning are replaced by infrastructure, So by building, digging, and engineering. It seems to be more technical than political, seemingly ignoring the cultural, integral, and political aspects of urban planning. And from where I stand, that's not a positive thing. Well, in almost every country, city planning deals with a diminished role of the government and an increased role of the private sector. Also in this conference, tomorrow we will have a number of speakers dealing with this shift. And while this is true, it could also be argued that in a country like China, through the combination of large-scale government planning, this very strong authoritarian regime, and the strong and well-established set of rules and regulations, that the shape and content of the Chinese city is being largely determined still by the government. And this brings us to James C. Scott. You probably read or have heard of his publication, Seeing Like a State, highly influential and praised publication. And for our group, it's mostly interesting because he criticizes the high modernist urban planning of the 20th century. He also criticizes Lenin's 5-year economic planning and Nyerere, forcing the whole population of Tanzania into artificial villages. But his talk about this modernist planning is most relevant. And in his book, he renounces the modernist cities like Brasilia because they are planned completely top-down. He regards them as being ridiculously zoned to a ridiculous extreme, and because they are an attempt at social engineering, which has failed. They are utopias turned out dystopias. So far, what's new, you would say, because that's sort of like the mainstream critique on these cities. But he doesn't just critique these cities. He also claims that the state can never plan in the right way, that it's just not well equipped to do so. It lacks the details, the sensibility, the small scale, the information about what is actually there, and the social insights. One quote, he says, the larger point is that in each case, the necessarily thin schematic model of social organization and production animating the planning was inadequate as a set of instructions for creating a successful social order. By themselves, the simplified rules can never generate a functioning community, city, or economy. Formal order, to be more explicit, is always, and to some degree, parasitic on informal processes, which the formal scheme does not recognize, without which it could not exist, and which it alone cannot create or maintain. So, while you could agree with this, when you look at new cities being built recently, they are almost always planned this way. Cities in the Middle East and Asia are completely ruled by top-down measures, by governments. And they seem to be the likely victims of all the risks that James Scott mentions. So how to plan within a system like that? Well, following James Scott, we could argue that it might be a good thing when government retreats and the market takes over. But in countries where new towns are built by the private sector, what is the result? Do they build better cities? For instance, what is the influence of the powerful building industry in Korea on urban and regional planning? What does it mean when civic engagement in today's democracy ends? And what is the influence of having social housing policies versus the absence of these? Or to put it in another way, what is the influence of orgware, of politics, of rules and regulations on the urban fabric and the functioning of the city? And then the last question, what happens at this moment, when a far greater export of urban planning takes place than we ever witnessed in the Cold War period, due to globalization, with Western engineers and designers fleeing out to more expensive areas, like this Dutch village in Shanghai shows? Well, it's not exactly an introduction to the program, I realize. It's more a tour d'horizon of a number of topics that we could talk about today and tomorrow. I think this is a perfect place, a perfect hall to engage in discussion. It's small and it's intimate. We have microphones which can be used as walking microphones, so feel free to interact in the discussions. There are if you feel slightly panicked because it's so hot in here, relax, because there was a failure in the heating system. It's being reset now, so it will cool down to a normal temperature. And last but not least, I have a few program changes to explain. Unfortunately, Kieran Long could not make it. We had him in the session today and tomorrow, but due to personal circumstances, he won't be here, which is a pity, but I will miss him. Arnold Reindorp, I already said he won't be here, but we found a very good replacement in Jaap-Jan Berg, who's sitting on the first row here. And the Elderman Adrie Duivenstein is unfortunately ill, but also here we have a perfect replacement in the person of Jacqueline Tellinga. That's tomorrow. Now I would like to hand over the microphone to Wouter Stiphout.